Alrighty, so the vision of the ram and the he-goat. Now we're told in the first two verses of chapter 8 that this vision takes place in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at first. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass, when I saw, that I was in Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai. Now, if you remember from Pastor's sermon the other Sunday back, he mentioned that Daniel is in this vision transported to a different location. He's taken to Shushan in the palace. And Shushan was actually the capital city of the Mede-Persian Empire. The 3rd year of Belshazzar takes place when Babylon is still on the throne. Belshazzar was the king when Babylon fell captive to the Medes and the Persians. So even though Daniel was in the period of the reign of Babylon, he is transported in this vision into the future, or not into the future, but into a different place, Shushan in the Medes and the Persians. So this vision takes place about 3 years after the events of chapter 7 that we saw last time. Now, in this vision, Daniel witnesses the rise and the fall of the next 2 great world empires. Those next 2 great empires are the empires of the Mede and Persian Empire, and then Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire. Now, interesting that Daniel was taken to Shushan. Why didn't God just give him the vision in Babylon? Well, my feeling is that God took him there because of the certainty that God would fulfill what he said he would do. He said Persia would take over Babylon. Babylon would fall, Persia would rise. And so Daniel is transported to this future capital of what was to come. Babylon would soon fall. And so what did Daniel see in this vision? In verse 3, it says, a ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher one came up last. So he sees a ram with 2 strange horns, one larger than the other. It seemed that the larger one grew after the first one. So this was no ordinary ram. This is a strange-looking ram with strange-looking horns. Now, we don't have to guess at the identity of this ram. Who does this ram represent? Nebuchadnezzar. Not Nebuchadnezzar, but a good guess. In verse 20, we're told, what was it? Not Satan. On the slide is verse 20. The ram which you saw having 2 horns, they are the kings of Mede and the Persians. So Daniel is seeing a vision of the coming kingdom of Persia represented by a ram. All right? And this ram had 2 horns. One was high, and the one that was higher came up last. Now, okay, class, from our previous studies, what was unique about the Mede and the Persian Empire that would explain these 2 strange horns that are described here? One bigger than the other, and that bigger one came up last. Anybody remember? A confederacy? No, an alliance. That's right. Good. That was good. Very good, Vern. The Medes and the Persian were an alliance. So we have these 2 horns representing the 2 alliances of this kingdom, the Medes and the Persians. Now, which one became more powerful later on in the kingdom? The Persians did. So this is a representation of, in the future, what would happen when the Medes and the Persians would come to power. There would be 2, that would be 1, and the Persians were stronger, and they became stronger later. When Babylon was conquered, the Medes conquered Babylon. But later on, the Persians administered the kingdom. And so we see a very good representation of exactly what was going to happen when the Medes and the Persians took power. But now notice what Daniel sees. And I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, southward. so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But this ram did according to his will and became great. We know from history that the Persian Empire started in the east and moved westward, northward, and southward, and it did become a great, great empire. Nobody could stand before the Persian Empire. It was really, really powerful and lasted quite a while. And the fact that it pushed westward, notice that. When it was pushing, its conquest westward took it to the coasts of Greece. When it came to Greece, it treated the Grecian city-states with great cruelty and brutality. And because of this, Alexander the Great, he vowed that he would destroy Persia. And so we see in the next verse, verse 5, the rise of Alexander the Great's kingdom. And I was considering, and suddenly a male goat came from the west. Right? So now we see a male goat. First we see a ram, now we see a goat. And this goat comes from the west, across the surface of the whole earth, not touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between its eyes. So Daniel sees another strange animal, a flying goat. The goat did not touch the ground. Now this is probably a reference to the swiftness at which Alexander the Great conquered the world. Anybody remember how many years it took him to conquer the entire known world at that time? Or the world that was of any influence at that time? 12 years. And mostly on foot, mostly by marching. That's pretty remarkable. See, what the Greeks would do is they would come into an area and they would take what they wanted and destroy everything. And they just kept moving. They didn't have to worry about administering any power, any property, or anything behind them because nothing was there. They would destroy it all. And it said this goat had one horn between its eyes. Now, who would that be representing? Alexander the Great, the great king of the Grecian Empire. And we're told that in verse 23. The male goat is the kingdom of Greece. Again, we don't have to guess at it. The large horn is the first king. So, God is making it very simple for us, very plain. And it says in verse 6 and 7, then this goat came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and he ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against the ram. He attacked the ram and broke his two horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him. But he cast the ram down to the ground, trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram out of his hand. So we see Daniel is being shown the viciousness and the total destruction that Alexander the Great brought to the Persian Empire. And you see, Alexander hated the Persian Empire for what they did to the Greeks. He vowed with personal vengeance the destruction of Persia. And his conquest was personal, and it was violent, and it was total. In fact, in the year 1330, when Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, he marched into the Persian capital, a place called Persepolis. And after looting the treasures, he burned the great palace and surrounding city to the ground, destroying hundreds of years' worth of religious writings and art, along with the magnificent palaces and audience halls which had made Persepolis the jewel of the empire. Didn't care anything about all that. He just wanted to destroy it, just take it out. He did. So Daniel is being shown the future of the coming two great empires that would follow Babylon. But now notice what else he sees in verse 8. Therefore, the male goat grew very great. Alexander the Great. But when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in its place, four notable ones came up toward the four winds of heaven. All right, so what is he seeing here? What happened to the Greek Empire that corresponds to what Daniel is seeing? Anybody remember? Okay, Alexander died. Okay, that's right. Alexander died when he was 32 years old. He was in Babylon, got drunk, and died. And the kingdom, because Alexander didn't have any children that could take the kingdom, he divided the kingdom up into 4 regions. And and those 4 regions were given to his 4 generals: Lysander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucid. Seleucid and Ptolemy took the Middle East and Africa. Lysimachus and Lysander took Turkey and the western part of the empire, which would have been Macedonia and Athens and Greece. And so they split it all up. All right? Now, why this is important is because from one of these empires, one of these kingdoms, will come a man that will be completely and ruthlessly against the Jewish people. His name is Antiochus Epiphanes. You might have heard that name before. He comes from one of Alexander the Great's kingdoms. In around 150 BC, he came to power. One of the things that he did, that we will see, is that he completely and totally set out to destroy the Jewish people. So Daniel is being told this because Daniel wanted to know what the future of his people would be. He was in Babylon at this time and being shown all these empires coming and going. And he's like, okay, great. But what does that mean to me? God's going to say, what that means to you, Daniel, is that there will come an empire that will bring from it a man who's going to be very, very brutal to your people. You need to write this down for them so that they will know it's coming. Now notice in verse 9. Where we are is Daniel sees this goat. The horn was broken. 4 horns came up. And out of one of those horns, out of one of those kingdoms, comes a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. That's verse 9. What Daniel is seeing here is the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes, a ruler who would come from one of those kingdoms that were divided from Alexander the Great's conquest. That kingdom was the Seleucid kingdom. Antiochus Epiphanes was a ruler who came from the Seleucid dynasty. The Seleucid dynasty covered the Middle East and Iraq and that area. So you've got the Iraqi area that we know so well, coming down into Jordan, Lebanon, and into the land of Israel. That's where the Seleucids came from. That's what they ruled. And Antiochus Epiphanes was a ruler from that area. He started his reign up north near Assyrian capital of Nineveh and Babylon. That area is where he came to power and ruled from. But during his reign, he began to push out and try and conquer other lands. And we're told that he grew great toward the south, which would have been Egypt, and he did try and conquer Egypt a number of times. Cleopatra was down there, and other rulers were down there. And he also pushed toward the east, and then it said toward the glorious land. Now, what's the glorious land? It's Israel. Now, this little horn, very important to note, is not the same as the little horn of chapter 7. Remember in chapter 7, we saw another little horn in chapter 7. That little horn came from the Roman Empire, which would come later. This little horn is different. This little horn comes from the kingdom of Alexander the Great, specifically the Seleucid kingdom. So we have to make sure we keep that in mind. We don't get confused with these little horns popping up here and there. Right? This little horn represents Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, there's 2 main reasons why Antiochus Epiphanes in this section in Daniel is so important to the people of Daniel. The first one is because this little horn, this Antiochus Epiphanes, he brought great destruction to Israel during the intertestamental period. That is, that period of time between the end of the Old Testament, which was Malachi, and the beginning of the New Testament, which was Matthew. It was about a 400-year period. where God didn't send any prophets, no books in the Bible were written. But a lot was going on, and one of the things that was going on is that God told Daniel there would be this little horn that would rise up and cause great destruction. Now, there's another reason why Daniel was given this image of this coming little horn. And it's because this little horn, Antiochus Epiphanes, is a mirror image of the coming Antichrist in origin and tactics, as this chapter and other places in the Scripture makes very clear. So Antiochus Epiphanes is not only a future threat to the nation of Israel during the intertestamental period, about 100 BC, he is a picture of the coming Antichrist who will again seek to destroy Israel. So this chapter becomes extremely important, not only to the Jewish people at the time, but the Jewish people in the future. So let's take a look at some characteristics of this little horn that God gives to Daniel. In verse 10, Daniel is told that this little horn grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. And that's a strange verse, isn't it? Not quite sure what it means. It might mean that there was extreme demonic conflict going on at this time. Remember, Pastor in last Sunday talked about how demons fight in heaven and with angels as God's purposes unfold on the earth. They're resisted by Satan and his angels, and there are other angels that are on God's side, and they fight with these demonic forces. That's why Paul said to us that we do not fight against flesh and blood. We fight against spiritual powers. Those are going on. So it could mean there's some of that going on, but it could also mean that this coming ruler, Antiochus Epiphanes, would manifest himself as a deity, that he would try and be like God. And in fact, that's exactly what he did. He actually called himself God Manifest. He wanted the people to think that he was God manifested in the flesh. That's how pompous and proud Antiochus Epiphanes was. He was a hater of God. He was a hater of Israel. And he was a destroyer of the Jewish people and the Jewish worship. And notice what verses 11 and 12 say. Regarding the little horn, this coming Antiochus Epiphanes, he even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away. And the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices. He cast truth to the ground. He did all this, and he prospered. Now we're told in these verses, that this coming destroyer did a few things. Antiochus Epiphanes. One of the things he did was that he took away the daily sacrifices in the temple. When he came into Jerusalem and took over, he went into the temple and he desecrated the temple. First of all, he killed all the priests. And then he set up an image of Jupiter in the temple. And then he desecrated the temple with swine's blood and broth. He bathed the entire temple inside all of the holy instruments, all of the altars, and everything that was associated with Jewish worship. He bathed in pig's blood, which would have made it unusable for the Jews. Another thing he did was he outlawed Jewish worship. If you were caught with a Bible, or if you were caught circumcising your child, for example, you would face death and torture. In fact, one of the things that he did was if you circumcised your child, your child would be killed, and then that dead child would be hung around the mother's neck, and then the mother would be crucified in the city square for everyone to see. This went on by the thousands, and he also murdered anybody who did anything that was associated with Jewish worship. He wanted to outlaw it completely. That's how brutal and ugly this person was. And he trampled truth to the ground. Now notice it says that because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifice. This is going to be hard for some people to take in. The reason God allowed this to happen, the reason God allowed Antiochus Epiphanes to rise to power was because of transgression. Whose transgressions do you think is being referred to? The transgressions of the Jewish people. Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. Because of the transgression of the Jewish people, because they had turned their back on God to a great degree, God allowed Antiochus Epiphanes to rise to power. And it was because he needed to chasten his people. He did it before when Assyria came down and conquered the northern empire. He did it when Babylon was destroyed because of the disobedience of the people. He did it here. See, this is hard for some people to take. Even today, some people welcome the mercy of God, but they cringe at the God of judgment. They can't take that. That's right. He does that. But the brutality that Antiochus brought, some people would say, how could God allow that to happen? Well, the truth is, he did. He has in the past. He will again in the future, move in judgment against his people Israel during the time of Jacob's trouble. There's coming a time in the history of the Jewish people, the future history of the Jewish people, where they once again will be chastised by the Lord. It's called the day of Jacob's trouble. It's that 7-year period we call the tribulation period that's coming in the future, when God will once again chasten his people and purify them. This is an example of that as well. But Antiochus Epiphanes reigned but a short period. That's the wonderful thing, is that God's judgment doesn't last forever in terms of his chastening of his people. Now look at what verses 13 and 14 says. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, and giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? He said to me, 2,300 days the sanctuary shall be cleansed. So approximately 6 years. And this coincides with the actual historical record of Antiochus' reign. He reigned about 6.5 years. From the time that he came in and took over Israel until the time he was cast out, it was about 6 years. So this is a comfort that his reign would not last forever, and then the sanctuary would be cleansed. And it was. God raised up a group of people that were in Israel at the time called the Maccabees. Now, the Maccabees were a courageous group of people, and they rose up against the rule of Antiochus Epiphanes, and they began to fight back, and they finally won. And Antiochus Epiphanes had to flee with his army out of Israel, and then the Maccabees went in and cleansed the temple and purified it. And one of the things that they did was they found the menorah to put olive oil in the menorah and light it, but they only had enough purified menorah for 1 week, I think it was. Not enough after that. They didn't have any olive oil, but they put the olive oil in the menorah, and the menorah kept burning. It kept burning. It was a miracle. It just kept burning and burning and burning until what's that? It was God's grace on his people. He was visiting them and renewing the covenant promises to them, and the blessings to them. And so the temple was cleansed, and now they celebrate that. You know what festival the Jews celebrate in order to remember when that temple was cleansed at the time? What is it? Rosh Hashanah. No, not Rosh Hashanah. Yeah. Well, at Christmas time is when they celebrate Hanukkah. Hanukkah, you've all heard of Hanukkah, right? Right. Hanukkah is when they remember the cleansing of the temple and the miracle of the lights being. That's exactly why they do. Okay. Now, so that's the story that Daniel is being shown: the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes, the coming of this brutal ruler who would do these terrible things to the Jews. And so it was a warning to them. Be aware, be on guard, look out. Okay? But the rest of the chapter becomes very interesting, because the rest of chapter 8 makes it pretty clear that Antiochus is also a type of the Antichrist that will come in the last days. In fact, Antiochus is almost a mirror image of the Antichrist to come in methods and tactics. And as I said before, he also foreshadows the region from which the Antichrist will arise. That part of the Greek kingdom ruled by Seleucid dynasty of Alexander's kingdom. All right? So why do I say that? Huh? On Greece. I'll show you a map. You'll see where Seleucid ruled and reigned. I'll also show you some interesting scriptures that confirm this as well. So the fact that Antiochus and Antichrist are type and antitype, or mirror and reflection, so to speak, we can see this in the Word of God as well. For example, both Antiochus and Antichrist will take control of Maccabees. Anybody familiar with the book of Maccabees? It's not in our Bible. It is a book in the Catholic Bible. It almost made it to our Bible, Protestant Bible. The reason it didn't make it in there is because there were some things in there that didn't meet the criteria for making it into Scripture. Well, the book of Maccabees is a book that was written that chronicles the history of the Jews during this intertestamental period. And it has in it the story of the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes. And what it says is that deceitfully he spoke peaceable words to them, and they believed him, they being the Jews. But he suddenly fell upon the city, dealt it a severe blow, and destroyed many people of Israel. So Antiochus Epiphanes came in and said, hey guys, I'm the good guy. I'm going to help you. I'm going to make everything wonderful. You give me your allegiance, and I'm going to make your life beautiful. Well, he didn't do that. And neither will the Antichrist. The Bible tells us the Antichrist is going to do the same thing. He's going to rise to power by deceit, and he will make an agreement, a covenant with the nation of Israel, guaranteeing their peace and security. But 3.5 years into his reign, he breaks that covenant and ushers in the Great Tribulation period. In fact, Psalm 55, verses 21 and 22 tells us this. And this is speaking of the coming Antichrist. He has put forth his hands against us who were at peace with him. He has broken his covenant. The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. So both Antiochus and the Antichrist come to power through deceit. And this is also chronicled in the book of Maccabees. He says, in those days lawless men came forth from Israel and misled many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles round about us. For since we separated from them, many evils have come upon us. So there were those in the nation of Israel that were pumping this up. Hey, let's just welcome this guy in. Let's just make this agreement with this Gentile. He's going to make it great for us. And those were these lawless men, it's called, in Israel. The Bible also says in the future that there's going to be one who's going to aid and help the Antichrist come to power. It's going to be the false Messiah that will rise up in the last days. And he will help the Antichrist in his rule and reign. He's called the worthless shepherd in the Bible, in Zechariah chapter 11. He's also spoken about in Revelation, which we will get to. So we're seeing this pattern of almost duplication going on here. Now, Zechariah paints a particularly frightful picture of the deceit and betrayal that ushers in the reign of Antichrist. Now, notice what Ezekiel 11 says. In verses 7 to 11, this is the Antichrist talking. He says, "So I fed the flock for slaughter. In particular, the poor of the flock. I took for myself 2 staffs. One I called Beauty, the other I called Bond. And I fed the flock. And I took my staff Beauty, and I cut it in two, that I might break the covenant which I had made with all the people, so it was broken on that day. Thus, the poor of the flock who were watching knew that it was the word of the Lord." And Revelation 6 says, "And looked, and behold, a white horse. And him who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer." This is a picture of the Antichrist coming in Revelation. He comes to conquer with power and with deceit. Comes in on a white horse. Who rides a white horse? No, when you turn on the Lone Ranger rides in on a white horse, doesn't he? Yeah, the Lord Jesus comes back on a white horse, but here's the problem: he doesn't come back to conquer and to conquering and to conquer, and it doesn't follow that death follows him, because when these 4 horsemen of the apocalypse ride, the first one is the white horse, and the second one is war and death, and all this stuff follows him. That picture is a picture of the coming Antichrist and his reign as it unfolds on the earth in the last 7 years of world history. But he comes in on a white horse. He's the champion. He's the hero. He's the good guy. He's the Lone Ranger coming in to clean up the town. Right. But he comes in with particular deceit. And notice, it says that he fed the flock for slaughter. You know who gave him the command to do this? If you look in Zechariah 11, the verse before that, the Lord lets him do this. The Lord allows the Antichrist to come to power. But notice what it says. "Thus the poor of the flock who were watching me knew that it was the word of the Lord." You see, there's always a godly remnant. And there will be a godly remnant in the future that see what's going on. Remember what Jesus told this godly remnant about the future in Matthew chapter 24? He said, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand." That's that flock that was watching what's going on. That's the flock that read Daniel, that knew what was coming. He said, "Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, for then there shall be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, or ever shall be." So God is preparing his people for what is to come. Now notice also that both Antiochus and Antichrist will desecrate the temple and declare themselves God. Now in Daniel chapter 8, verse 11, it says that the Antiochus exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And notice what Antichrist will do in 2 Thessalonians 2:4. He opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. That's what Antichrist will do when he breaks his covenant with Israel and begins to usher in the Great Tribulation period, which will be a time of great trouble and distress for the people of God. Now here's what's interesting. Both Antiochus and Antichrist will come from the region of the Middle East. Now, we are told in a number of places in the Scripture that in the last days there will be an invading army that comes in and invades Israel. We read about that in Revelation when it talks about the Battle of Armageddon, where God will gather all the nations together to fight. That takes place in Israel. But there's other places that talk about an invasion of Israel. And what's interesting is that in the last days, Israel will be invaded by the northern army. That's how this invasion is described. Now, this is not the invasion by this Assyrian army that took place in 700 BC. And it's not the invasion spoken of by Ezekiel 38 and 39, where Gog and Magog come in. You can read about those. This invasion occurs in the last days and is led by Antichrist, when all nations are gathered against Israel. And it's interesting. What it is saying is that the Antichrist will come from the area of the Greek Empire that Assyria, the region of Assyria, was contained in. And the Antichrist is also called the Assyrian in Scriptures. And if you want to read about some passages, read some passages that identify what I'm talking about, they're here. Joel chapter 2, Micah 5, Isaiah 10, Isaiah 14, and Zechariah 11, and also Zechariah 14. I think it's 14. The last chapter in Zechariah. All talk about this coming invasion of Israel by the armies of Antichrist. He's called the northern army, and he's called the Assyrian. You know why he's called the Assyrian? Because he comes from that area that was Assyria. That Seleucid Empire, the little horn, that one kingdom that from that area, Antiochus Epiphanes rose, but also the Antichrist will come. So here's the map of the Seleucid kingdom. It's the one in the yellow. Okay. This was Ptolemy, and Cassander, and Symmachus, or maybe it was the opposite. But here's Seleucid. Right? This is where Antiochus Epiphanes came from, and Assyria would have been located up around in this area, in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley up in here. And so we're told in numerous places that the Antichrist will invade Israel. He's called the Northern Army. He's called the Assyrian. And so we can, and we're also told that he comes from that region. So we can be pretty sure that sometime in the future, when the Roman Empire becomes revived again and ruled by 10 authorities, it will also incorporate this part of the Roman Empire. This all became part of the Roman Empire. So from this region of the Roman Empire, this little horn will rise up in the future. So both Antiochus and Antichrist's reigns are cut short when God's purposes are complete. We saw in verses 13 and 14 that Antiochus ruled for about 6 years. But 2 Thessalonians 2:8 tells us that when the lawless one is revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and will destroy with the brightness of his coming, that his reign will last 7 years. So now Gabriel is sent to Daniel to help him understand the vision. In verses 15 and 16, it says, "And then it happened, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man." So an angel is sent to Daniel to clarify what he's seeing, because this is important stuff. God wanted Daniel to be clear on what this is. And he says, "I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai who called and said, 'Gabriel, make this man understand the vision.' So the angel Gabriel is sent to Daniel." Yeah, Angel Gabriel. You know, it's the first time in the Bible where Angel Gabriel is mentioned. And it seems to be that Gabriel is the angel that is sent whenever important parts of God's program are about to take place. He is seen here. He's also seen in chapter 12 of Daniel. And then when Mary was to be pregnant, Gabriel was the one that was sent to bring the message to Mary as well. He seems to be the messenger angel assigned to make known important information about God's coming program on the earth. So we see him here, and he makes clear to Daniel a few things that are very important. He clarifies what Daniel's seeing. The ram, the goat, Medes and Persians, and Greece. But he also makes a very interesting statement to Daniel. He says, "So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid. I fell on my face. He said to me, 'Understand, Son of Man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. And he said, look, I am making known to you what will happen in the latter time of the indignation, for an appointed time the end shall be. So Gabriel here is taking what God has given to Daniel in this vision of the ram and the he-goat and the four horns and the little horn, and he's taking that and he's projecting it out into the future. Multiple times in this chapter, Daniel is told this refers to the end time. This is going to be something that's going to be happening in the distant future. Confirming that Antiochus' reign is actually a mirror, a pattern, a foreshadowing of the coming Antichrist. He said the ram you saw are the two kings of Medes and Persia. We saw that. We saw that the large goat with the horn was Greece with the first king. We saw that. So Gabriel clarifies it for Daniel. He says, hey, Daniel, this is what you saw. This is what it means. Doesn't want you to miss it. He doesn't want us to miss this. But now notice what he says. In the latter time of their kingdom. Okay, what kingdom? The four kingdoms of Alexander the Great's general. In the latter time of their kingdom, when transgressors have reached their fullness. In other words, it's going to be as bad as it's going to get. In fact, Jesus said if those days weren't cut short in the tribulation period, no flesh would survive. When transgressions have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. Now, some interpreters take all of this as meaning Antiochus Epiphanes, that he's talking again about the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes. I don't see it that way, because the language is too specific as to when this fierce king will arise. It's in the latter days. It's in the end times. It's at the time of the end. It's when transgressors have come to a full. And we're told in the Bible that in the end days, there's going to be an apostasy, a falling away. The church will become corrupted. And Paul said, in the last days, men will become very, very evil. Very bad. And so false prophets, Jesus said, will come, and wars and all kinds of stuff. So we're talking about a time that is still future to us, a time that will be full of transgressors, and a fierce king will arise. He's talking about the Antichrist here. And he's talking about the Antichrist specifically coming from the latter time of these four kingdoms, specifically Seleucid. The latter time of their kingdom refers to the time when the Roman Empire will be revived and will rule the world in the last days, when transgressors have reached their fullness. That revised Roman Empire will contain the kingdom of Alexander the Great, conquered by Rome. And from that part of the Roman Empire, specifically the Seleucid kingdom, will come a fierce king in the last days, who is called the Antichrist. So the rest of this chapter now outlines what this fierce king will be like, this coming Antichrist. First of all, we're told that this vision, this coming Antichrist, will be in the last times. You see that in verse 17, 19, 23, and 26. He doesn't want us to miss it. And he pinpoints the region from which Antichrist will come. That's verse 23. In the latter days of their kingdoms. And because the Antiochus Epiphanes, this Seleucid ruler, came from that region and is so closely patterned and mirrored to the Antichrist, we can pretty well assume that he will mirror the Antiochus. The Antichrist will mirror the Antiochus coming from the Middle East. It says he'll be Satan-controlled, and that's verses 23 and 24. And we know that to be true of Antichrist. Revelation 13:4. So we see that when the Antichrist comes to power, that he will cause all to worship Satan. He is a Satan worshiper, and he will lead the world into the worship of Satan because Satan gave him the power. This Antichrist is going to be demon-controlled, Satan-controlled. he's going to have the power of the evil one to rule and reign. And it says his rule will be over all people. And that's verse 24 of Daniel. And it says he comes to power by deception, this fierce king of fierce continent. In verse 25, and then also in chapter 9:27, we see in Daniel that this coming Antichrist will use deception and will make a covenant with the nation of Israel and then break it. So he mirrors Antiochus Epiphanes, but he comes to power through great deception. 1 Thessalonians 5:1-4 says the same thing. That when the people are crying, peace and safety, that's what Antichrist is going to promise. But that's not what's going to happen. And it says he will be a blasphemer, in verse 25, and also in 2 Thessalonians 2:4. And then this one is destroyed by the second coming of Christ. And we'll read about that in Revelation when Christ returns to the earth. But it also says that this one, in verse 25 of Daniel 8, is destroyed, but not by human hand. That is, God will destroy Antichrist at his second coming. And we read about that also in 2 Thessalonians 2:8 and Revelation 19:20. So there's a lot in this chapter that the Jews would find very valuable, especially in the last days when the Antichrist sets up the abomination of desolation in the temple. This image of himself, I would assume, that the Bible says he will set up in the temple and then cause all to worship him. Those that understand, the Jewish remnant, those that are reading and understanding and seeing what's going on, as Zechariah 11 said, those that are watching will know. And God says, when you see it, flee. They will flee. Many of the Jews will flee the land in that day when the Antichrist takes power, and they will be protected by God. We read about that in Revelation chapter 13, I think, 12. So we see that God will prepare a place for his people to be protected during that period of time. So